to Books with Brooks. This is a minisode where I announce next month's book club book. So you can borrow it or check it out or listen to it. And you have until the end of December when I'll be back on the podcast with some pals and we'll talk about it. I like to say this book club's format is read along and listen in. So you can do that. So last December, we read a short story by Frederick Bachman, who I love, who is really famous for writing A Man Called Ove, I think is how you say it. But the short story we read was called The Deal of a Lifetime. It's a really short, holiday kind of story that had really cute drawings. It was in this cute little hardcover book. It was great. I know people are always swamped during the holidays. There's parties and cooking and shopping and traveling and relatives, and so there's a lot going on. So I'm picking another short story this year. Well, actually a couple of them. So without further ado, and I always ask myself for a drum roll one of these days. I will edit that in. Our December 2019 book is a book of 3 holiday short stories by Truman Capote. They're called, number 1, A Christmas Memory. Number 2, One Christmas. And the third one is called The Thanksgiving Memory. So it's a 3-for-1. And they come all published together, but they're short, autobiographical short stories about his childhood holidays in his childhood. The most famous one is A Christmas Memory, and it was published in 1956 in Mademoiselle magazine. One Christmas wasn't actually published until 1982 in the December issue of Ladies' Home Journal, and I couldn't find when The Thanksgiving Memory was first published. I don't know. I assume somewhere in the middle. I personally don't read a lot of short stories. I always think, like, if I'm going to read, I'd rather get the full version, I guess. I don't know. But every time I do pick up a short story, I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, you can tell a really effective, moving story in only a few pages. And I think that's impressive and maybe even harder to do. I don't know. We could debate that endlessly. This year I did read another collection of short stories called Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. And one of the stories in that book is what they based the entire movie Arrival on, which is nuts. I loved that movie, and so I picked this book up, and I thought that the whole book was going to be like the movie, but it was just one little short story, and then there was like 10 other ones equally as amazing in this book. I highly recommend Stories of Your Life and Others. It's so good. They're all super different. Anyways, I almost never read short stories, but then when I do, I'm like, oh, I gotta do this more. So I'm really looking forward to this. These are obviously classics by a literary titan, Truman Capote. So let's talk about Truman Capote. You may know him from In Cold Blood, his famous, what did he call it? I think it was like a historical novel about a family in Nebraska? ? Who's murdered. As a true story of a family who was like brutally murdered in their farmhouse. And he went and he researched it and wrote a book about it. It's great. If you haven't read it, it's super interesting. I think I read it in high school or college. I think it's usually on like the banned books list if you ever did that project. He was very famously friends with Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. They grew up together in Monroeville, Alabama. But he was actually born in 1924 in New Orleans as Truman Streckfus Persons. And he was later adopted by his stepdad, who changed his name to Truman Garcia Capote. But he lived in Monroeville, and that's where he met Harper Lee. But that's also where he met like an old aunt. I don't actually know how she's related to him, but he calls her Sook, Sook. And she, I think, helped raise him for a while when he lived there. So she plays really prominently in these short stories about his childhood and the holidays. So here's a quote from him about short stories that I liked. And it says, Finding the right form for your story is simply to realize the most natural way of telling the story. The test of whether or not a writer has divined the natural shape of his story is just this. After reading it, can you imagine it differently? Or does it silence your imagination and seem to you absolute and final? As an orange is final. As an orange is something nature has made just right. So that's kind of cool. I do like the idea of like your story will tell you what form it should take or how it should be told or how long it needs to be. I like that idea. That it's sort of like a two-way street. Okay. So I guess Truman Capote, when he was really young, he worked as a copy boy in the art department at the New Yorker. And he worked there for 2 years, but then he got fired because he made Robert Frost angry, like the poet Robert Frost. He was, I mean, Capote is, he's an extremely famous writer. In Cold Blood made him very famous. But he also was famous for like hobnobbing. He really like ran in high circles. He was like friends with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis' sister and royalty and all of the great writers of the time. So he really rubbed elbows at the highest sort of societal spaces. And he was openly gay at a time when obviously that wasn't very common. He had a long-term relationship with writer Jack Dunphy and a couple of other people. Unfortunately, he died just before his 60th birthday in 1984, and it was likely of a drug overdose or long-term substance abuse. He had a drinking and drug problem later in life that was fairly public. He would get drunk and like go on talk shows. He was kind of scandalous. In 2013, a Swiss publisher discovered 14 unpublished stories that he wrote when he was a teenager in the New York Public Library archives, and they were published in 2015 under the title The Early Stories of Truman Capote. So that's kind of cool. I love the idea that you can just find unpublished like work from famous people like nowadays. So yeah, Capote, I think, is maybe a controversial figure. In Cold Blood was certainly a bit controversial. But he overall, like, I mean, you know, you can't deny he's a wonderful writer. And I was reading a lot about him, and he was writing he like taught himself to read and write before grade school. And then he was like he was like writing 3 hours a day at the age of 11. So he was a person who felt, I think, very called to this occupation, and the writing just sort of came out of him. It had to. So now is the part where I read the back cover of the book. I will give a disclaimer, because this is a series of short stories and they've been published. They're kind of old. They've been published in a bunch of different versions over the years. You can actually get A Christmas Memory on its own, just one short story that has been published by itself. So if that's all you can find, just read that this month. That's cool. We'll focus on that one because I think it's the most famous one, and then we'll talk about the others too. But hopefully you can find there's a hardcover 3-story collection on Amazon that's called A Christmas Memory, One Christmas, and the Thanksgiving Visitor. So that's the back cover I'm going to read now. Available for the first time in a single volume are the 3 holiday stories that Truman Capote regarded as among his greatest works of short fiction. 2 of these childhood memoirs, A Christmas Memory and The Thanksgiving Visitor, center on the author's early years with a family of distant relatives in rural Alabama. Both pay loving tribute to an eccentric old maid cousin, Miss Sook Falk, who became his best friend. In A Christmas Memory, Miss Sook, Buddy, the narrator, and their dog Queenie celebrate the Yuletide in a hilariously tipsy state. In the poignant reminiscence, One Christmas, 6-year-old Buddy journeys to New Orleans for a reunion with his estranged father that shatters many illusions. And in The Thanksgiving Visitor, Miss Sook invites the school bully Odd Henderson, called by Buddy the meanest human creature in my experience, to Thanksgiving dinner. Ooh. Hello. Oh, actually, something that this makes me think of. So he died in 1984, and apparently his last words were, hey, something like, hello, it's me, Buddy. And Buddy was the nickname that Miss Sook gave him. So those were supposedly his last words, which is kind of sad, but also kind of sweet. And you can see that this person, Miss Sook, obviously had a really strong impact on him, that he was writing about her much later into life, and considered these stories like some of his favorites and his best works. So this is a collection of 3 different poems that are all sort of topically related. They're all holiday stories, so I think they will be appropriate. There are 7 copies, I think, available at the Chicago Public Library. It's on Amazon. I'm going to look around and see where else you can find it. Unfortunately, there is no Audible version of this book, but for those of you who like to listen and not to read, there is you can YouTube it, and you can actually, I found one, I think I found all of them, but I found one that is A Christmas Memory, and it's actually Truman Capote reading it. So that's kind of cool. So I think you can find them. They've been performed endlessly as, I think, like short plays and stuff. So you can certainly find them to listen to them, but they aren't on Audible. I also think that the library version comes with a disc of them on audio. So if you get that, and anyone can play CDs, I cannot, then you could listen to it too. So yeah, I'm excited to read this. I read In Cold Blood. I want to say that's the only Capote I've read. I'd have to look back. But I've definitely read In Cold Blood, and it made a big impression on me. I think I read it in high school. It's sort of like true crime before true crime, before My Favorite Murder. So, but then, some people have an issue with it because he did take a real story and he wrote it, but also he took liberties with the story and filled in the gaps himself. So it's not really true, but it's pretty close to true, I guess. It's, mimicking real life. So I don't know. We're going to talk about that a lot, actually, for our November book as well, which is a historical fictional novel. The Alice Network, if you haven't read it yet. Yeah. So try to go out and find it or listen to it on YouTube. Hoping it's not super time consuming. I know everyone's busy, but perhaps it will help get us into the holiday spirit. And enjoy some Capote. So happy reading. I love you all. Happy almost Thanksgiving. And we'll be back soon to talk about the book. Bye. Books with Brooks is in the Press Play Podcast Network, and our theme music is by Jonathan Allen.